I am on my way to meet Chad Miles from A Level Deeper podcast. He lives in a van with his wife and he travels the country and he records this podcast.
Hey, welcome inside my home. I've seen the power of effective marketing for a podcast because podcasts are very difficult to grow. Sometimes as creators, we've got to just dumb it down to the simplest format because otherwise there's so many barriers that get in the way of actually starting the creative process. And I think if you're constantly trying to be other people and do things the way that they do things, you're missing out on all the opportunities that make you unique. You've got to have a conversation in the beginning as far as why are you doing this podcast in the first place?
Now we get to go a little deep with Chad and follow him behind the scenes for his podcast while he sets up.
Hey, welcome inside my home. Come on in.
Oh my God. How tall are you?
So I'm 6'5", and that was one of the very intentional things. I'm closing the fan outside. One of the very intentional things about this build was that Ford makes the tallest van on the market, so it was important that I was going to be able to stand up in it, and I can. My head touches the ceiling, but it works. My name is Chad Miles. I am a creator, a marketer. I live in a van with my wife and my 50-pound Australian Shepherd named Sadie. Today we are recording a podcast. So I started a podcast about 4 months ago, and I actually started it in the middle of our trip to Alaska. So not the most ideal place to start a podcast, but I figured out how to get the process going and started in my van. 7-8 years ago, when van life started becoming more popular, I started seeing some of the YouTube channels pop up, and I started seeing people posting on Instagram, and I was like, wow, something about that. You know, you always see the picturesque pictures of people's back doors open and they're on the beach, or they got the mountains back there, and I was like, man, that looks so cool. And then the big buts come in, and you're like, well, but I've got a full-time job, and you know, my wife and I, we're from the same area, and our families are here, and you know, that just doesn't make sense. And so 3, 4, 5 years went down the line, and then the pandemic hit, COVID hit, and we started working remote. And my wife and I spent time up in northern Michigan during that time, and we just really liked the slow pace of life up there, and we were kind of like, you know, this feels good, this feels nice, and that got us kind of back thinking like, well, maybe we could work remotely, and if we could, where would we want to be and where would we want to work from? And so that got us back to thinking, we thought of maybe going the tiny house route, and then we were like, well, but we really want to be able to actually travel. And so that led us back to the van, and we looked at bigger RVs, ultimately decided on the van because we liked that it was small, mobile, and you can take it anywhere. When we bought it, it was just an empty, blank cargo van, just steel back here. And it was a delivery van for like UPS. And so there was nothing back here. It took us about 4 months. I was working on it at times 10 to 12 hours a day. And over the period of 4 months, we built it all, about 95% of it ourselves. It was a period of 4 months. I couldn't tell you how many hours. I mean, hundreds of hours. And my wife and I joke, a lot of it was just me sitting here staring at things, trying to figure out how do you build structures into a van that's not square and it's not level. I mean, there's been a lot of things that we've learned. I think, you know, one of them is that you need so much less than you think you need. So there's a couple things I always have to think of. I always tell people, you know, when we travel in this vehicle, we don't have unlimited power. This doesn't relate to the podcast, but we don't have unlimited water. We don't have unlimited Wi-Fi. So we have to be really cognizant of all those things. When we were in remote Alaska, there was no cell phone service. So we also have, it's put away right now, but we also have a satellite dish. It's called a Starlink, and it's tucked away up here in this cabinet. We have to get creative with our space, but essentially that's a big satellite dish that we can just throw on top of the van, and we can get high-speed internet access from anywhere that we are. It takes about 15 minutes to set up. So we've got options if we're in cities and if we're in remote places. When I first started, my wife and I had a Shure brand wireless headset mic, like you would see in like an exercise class, like a yoga teacher would wear, which is what we initially bought it for. And you know, going back to that same idea, I didn't want to start the show because like I don't want to wear this silly headset looking mic during my interviews. And but we were living in the van, and that's all that we had, and that's all that we had space for. And so that has been the mic that I've worn for probably half of the shows is a headset mic. You'll see videos with me wearing that. And then this is just a basic USB mic that I've had at home as well. So I've found it can be easy in the audio world to get really overwhelmed by all of the super high quality stuff and think that you've got to have this really elaborate setup and you got to have what the Joe Rogans are using. And I've just found that you don't have to invest a ton of money in order to get a high quality audio output. If you know how to use the mic, if you know how to set it up, and then if you know how to do some basic editing, or you've got someone who can do some basic editing, you can make a $50 USB mic sound really good. And so I try not to overcomplicate from an audio standpoint, the audio portion of the show. I run my video through OBS.
Okay.
And essentially what I'm doing is the camera goes into OBS, the mic goes into OBS, and then I use the virtual camera setting from OBS to then ultimately, take what OBS is outputting and put that into, I use a virtual platform called Iris to do my recordings. But it took me one day like 6 or 7 hours of just sitting and toying with this, watching YouTube videos, trying to figure it all out on my own. I'm in marketing, so the work that I do, I work with podcast clients. I help them produce their shows, I've helped them get video setups, and then I create social media content for their shows. I've seen the power of effective marketing for a podcast because podcasts are very difficult to grow. And so for a long time, what's held me back is from starting my own is just thinking that there's a right way to start a podcast. I've got to have the video, I've got to have everything in order. I've got to be able to do social media. I've got to be able to put them on YouTube and to check all of those boxes. And every time I would think about that and think about living in the van, I would just get overwhelmed by it. So what I'm setting up today is a sort of evolved version of what the podcast started out as. But when I first started the show, it was audio only. So I would just hop on Zoom with my guest. We would each record a local audio file on our own computers. And that was it. I didn't record any of the video through Zoom because I had to just keep it really simple to stop myself from overthinking so that I could just get the project started. I'm 20 episodes in, and slowly I've built on to my setup. And so now I've incorporated a video element to it. I've upgraded the recording software that I use. But I think it's important just that sometimes as creators, we've got to just dumb it down to the simplest format, because otherwise there's so many barriers that get in the way of actually starting the creative process. But once you get started, you can always add on. You can always make it better. Sometimes we just got to start. There's just so many things, and there's so much, a lot of times it's up here. There's so much internal dialogue as to why me? What does it matter what I have to say? Why is anyone going to care? What are my friends and my family going to think? So there's all of that before you even get to all of the technology pieces of things, which can be overwhelming. So I feel like as creators, there's so many things that are already stacked against us that that's why we've got to try to make it as simple as we can just to get started. The more that you compare, and the more that ultimately you try to be someone else, then the less that you're being yourself. And the less that you're being yourself, then the less that you're focusing on what's your angle, what's your message, what's your story. And I think if you're constantly trying to be other people and do things the way that they do things, then you're missing out on all the opportunities that make you unique. And I think that each of us has something that we can bring to the table, and something about our story and our perspective and our experiences. People will resonate with that. And I think on kind of a deeper level, you learn about what really sustains you and what lights you up and what you need from a more spiritual, emotional standpoint. And so connecting with people on the road, spending time in nature, I think those things have been really meaningful, and I've learned that I appreciate that. My show is very much just about people's life experiences. It's called A Level Deeper. I want to have below the surface conversations. I want to talk about what people have learned in their life, what they've gone through, how that's affected them, how they view themselves, physically, emotionally, their health, those kinds of things. So it's a very just human-oriented, human story conversation. In the element of not wanting to control these conversations and allow them to sort of organically unfold, it's been a process of me trusting myself as a listener and as an interviewer. So I enter conversations with usually about 3 to 5 bullet points of 1 to 2 words. They're not even full formatted questions. They're just topics about someone that I find interesting and that I think we could dive into. That's my guiding post. So essentially the only question that I will think of or plan is my first question. And then aside from that, if I need to look back at my notes, I will, but oftentimes I don't, because then from there, it's just listening. And I think any good interview guest, I think if you are not actually listening to your guest, and any good interview host, if you're not actually listening to your guest, and as your guest is talking and responding to the question that you just asked, if all you're doing is automatically thinking of what is my next question, then you're missing the opportunity to hear them and to respond to them. And that doesn't make them feel heard or understood. And you could be missing something so rich that maybe it was one comment they made or one word that they used, or a lot of times it's at the very end of their response to your question that they'll throw out, kind of a line for you to grab onto and say, oh, this is something we could dive into more. So I've really developed this whole relationship with my ability to just listen and be an engaged conversationalist, and trusting that that's going to lead to my next question, and that's going to lead to an hour-long conversation. Sometimes that produces a lot of anxiety. I'm going into this hour-long conversation with someone I've never met before. I don't know them at all. I have 3 bullet points. How are we going to talk for an hour? And yet, here I am 20 episodes in, and every time I've never had the issue of getting stuck or not having a question. And if that were to ever happen, I think that's okay as well. Like the nature of my show is about being human, and I can just say, like, hey, I don't have a question, let's talk about something else. And I think that'd be okay, but it hasn't even happened yet. So when I'm preparing, a lot of times, like, I'm just going on someone's social media, I'm looking for a couple of things that expresses something about who they are that's unique, or something about their story or experience that's unique. You've got to get sort of creative, and from a qualitative perspective, be able to ask people and have conversations with people and look for ways in which your podcast is impacting you and your business, because they're not always going to just jump out in front of you or jump off the page as far as being really clear that this podcast is leading to this outcome. There's already so much like emotional capital that we have to invest just to get the things that we're creating out and to put them into the world. And every time I publish, I'm always like, oh, I sound terrible and all these things. So I think those things can get in the way and can be difficult sometimes from a business standpoint, and why it's important to have other perspectives in your life, because otherwise you're just sitting and you're seeing it from one vantage point, and you're just, everything that goes into it, how difficult it is to do, all the voices in your head that are saying X, Y, and Z isn't good enough and it's not perfect. And those things limit you from thinking a little bit just outside the box and thinking of some things that maybe would make a lot of sense. You've got to have a conversation in the beginning as far as, why are you doing this podcast in the first place? Because from a growth standpoint, I have found that podcasting is one of the most difficult mediums to grow. It's not like social media where people are naturally going and investing time, searching, looking for podcasts. People don't go into Apple Podcasts or Spotify and just start searching for random shows that they might want to watch. If you're going to invest 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours with someone listening to a podcast conversation, it takes a lot of equity from a relationship standpoint to believe in this person and want to hear what they have to say, and then ultimately want to hear what their guests have to say if they're doing an interview type show as well. So anyway, from a growth standpoint, it's very challenging. So with any client that I work with, we have that conversation up front, And so if that is the case, then we've got to be really clear about, so then why are we doing the show? It's likely not going to be an income producing show for a very long time. And unfortunately, the odds are that it's probably never going to, through the actual show itself, from like an advertising standpoint, it's likely not going to produce revenue. So then if you're a business owner, is it fulfilling some kind of just personal desire? That's what it is mostly for me, is I personally enjoy the process. I want to have these conversations. If you want it to grow in some way, are you becoming a better speaker? Are you building these relationships? Are you getting referrals or client opportunities? So there's a lot of ways tangentially to look at your podcast efforts and ultimately decide if it's helping you. But if you're not clear on those things and why you're starting it, if your goal is just to grow a podcast and make a bunch of money doing it, it's probably not the right medium for you. You know, if someone does want to ultimately get into maybe professional speaking or different mediums, like I think being able to be an effective communicator is a really important, just an important skill set in today's world, especially in today's digital world. And I think the more that you're able to communicate effectively, that unlocks a lot of opportunities for you. I think that's one of the things that I've noticed as well in hosting my own show is, and I was just talking with someone about this, a filming client the other day, is that I've become a lot more aware of myself as a communicator. I've learned a lot about all of the times when I listen back to the episodes and I'm editing them and I hear all of my uhs and my ums, and I was a big person. And so you hear all of these little verbal tics that you have, and in becoming more aware of them, you can start to remove some of those things and I think just become a better communicator. So I see that I have grown a lot in my ability to ask thoughtful questions, to communicate my ideas, to just slow down and pause at times and not have to fill space with those filler words. If I was kind of going through the traditional path, I went to a good high school, I chose a good college, I chose a good major, I was doing internships, I was going to work for General Motors, so I felt like I was checking all the boxes that I was supposed to in my life. And it wasn't until probably a couple of years later when I was going down that path when I realized, I'm not sure this is the path for me, and I'm not sure this is the path that I would choose. Now knowing that life can be short, and it can be shorter than we think it's going to be. And so that level of impatience led me to, I guess, just believe I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to wait to pursue the things that are meaningful to me. I'm not going to wait to go after some of my dreams and to make the impact that I want to make in the world. My dad died when he was 50 years old, and he had dreams that he didn't get to see or to realize. And so I guess it just kind of, I made it my mission at that point to not have that be the case for me. And I was going to go after things, even though it wasn't a convenient time, even though I was young, even though maybe I hadn't accomplished some of the status-oriented things that I thought I wanted to. I shifted my perspective and ultimately thought, I want to pursue the things that are meaningful to me. I want to make my life as meaningful as possible so that whenever my time comes, I can say, I didn't hold back. The life that I lead is very, very different. And yet it is a life that feels true to me. It feels true to what I value in life and what I want out of this life experience. And when I can go to bed at night feeling like I'm living the life that I have chosen for myself, and it feels right for myself and for my wife, and we are building this life together, that is an incredible feeling. And it doesn't make it easy. There's a lot of difficult things about the lifestyle that I have chosen. There's a lot of difficult things about being an entrepreneur and the work that I have chosen. It's not easy, but it's incredibly, incredibly fulfilling. And I think that's the most important thing. When you're a creator, when you're an entrepreneur, you've got to wear so many hats. So like the sort of sales part of the Patreon has been like a challenge for me. It makes me uncomfortable to ask people for money. And so I continue to learn that creating is one thing, but the getting your creations seen and supported has a lot to do with your ability to market and sell what it is that you're creating. So that's why, like, as we talk about podcasts and how difficult they are to grow, that's why I say often podcasting and for many things this is the case. It's not a build it and they will come type of platform, so it takes a lot of promotion, a lot of marketing, a lot of explaining to people what the episodes are about and why they should listen. It's not necessarily something that you can just create and then people are just going to stumble upon it. And so same thing with the Patreon. I've been noticing it takes a lot of selling, and that's something that I sort of struggle with at times as a creator. Is like, I just want to create. I don't want to go have to sell it afterward. But those things very much go together if you want to have a successful business and if you want the things that you create to ultimately be seen.
I always think of starving artists. I'm like, if they can do it, I can do it, right? Like, you're doing it for the love of the art, and if people come to you because they align with that, then amazing. But bills still have to be paid, so it's like this catch-22.
It's the constant battle that we have to navigate as creators, as business owners. It's challenging, but I think that's my approach with this show, is that because I have experience in podcasting, because I have experience in marketing, I know that my approach to this show is not super conducive to the show's growth. Meaning, my topic or my niche is deep conversations. If like 2 to 5% of your audience might come support you on a platform like Patreon just allows people to essentially, it's a platform to accept money, for creators, for things that they're creating. So, for example, the show. And my audience, it's not big enough to support the numbers. So if 2% of my audience if I'm getting 500 downloads, per month, then it's not driving a whole lot of money. And the thing about Patreon is that it's kind of an exchange for additional content or additional access. And so the numbers haven't really been working from the standpoint of, like, I think I'm making like $30 a month for my Patreon, which has been great. It's supporting to cover some of my basic costs. The show runs me about $50 to $60 per month when it comes to all of the technology subscriptions that I have in order to be able to do it. I'm going to pause the Patreon for now, though, and go to just more of like a virtual tip jar type format, like a buy me a coffee, so that people could just give one time, and it could just be like, hey, if you enjoyed this episode, you can buy me a coffee to support editing the next one, something like that. So I think my initial goal is just to cover the cost of the show. And if I can do that, then from a monetization standpoint, I'm going to call that good. Again, knowing how difficult they are to grow, I'm not expecting that I'm going to get a big advertising deal. I know that typically you've got to have 10,000 downloads a month in order for that to start to become a realistic expectation. So I have a long ways to get there. So I'm really just focused on the quality of the conversations. I'm focused on, am I having fun doing this? Is it fitting into my life? And if I can just cover my basic costs on a monthly basis, then I would say that that's going to be a win for now. If someone came to me and said, hey, I want to start a podcast and I want to grow as fast as possible, we would use traditional marketing thinking, which would be, all right, well, let's pick a really defined topic. Let's pick a really defined niche. Who are you trying to speak to? How is it going to benefit them? And let's try to tap into an existing community that can rally around a particular topic. If you want to grow, that would be a great formula. Knowing all of that, I have chosen to go the super vague, let's just have deep conversations about 100 different topics route. So I made that decision because all of this goes back to the thinking of, you've got to have clarity on why you're doing it in the first place. I would love for the show to one day be something that could produce an income and support some of my lifestyle. I don't expect that. That could be 2 to 5 years down the line where it could start to at least contribute something. So my goal is not to grow this as fast as possible. My goal is to have the meaningful conversations that I want to have. So I am intentionally taking a route that I know will lead to slower growth, but will be much more fulfilling for me. And so that's why that question of why am I doing this is just so important. But having a show called A Level Deeper, where we just talk about deep things, doesn't necessarily lead to, discoverability. but I love it, and I wouldn't change anything about it.
Chad was great. Really just gave me the time, and I love that. Didn't feel like he was checking his phone or hurrying me out of the van, which was nice. Sometimes it takes me a minute to just sort of like, okay, is that good enough? Like, did we get what we needed? That's what he asked. Did you get what you needed? And I kind of said, like, you know, it is what it is. Like, that moment was that moment. You know, the time we spent together was what it was. If I missed something, you know, my bad. Then maybe I wasn't paying attention enough, and I should have asked a follow-up. But he brought it all back around with his last question and his last answer. So it was absolutely perfect, I think. So I'm so happy to have met him. That was just a great conversation with a like-minded individual, and sometimes you just need that validation that what you're doing is the right thing. Finding joy in creating sometimes just for me is really enough, and I'm putting more effort into long form. As much as I love a short form video to watch when I consume, as a creator, it's not giving me the space I need to like set up the joke or to set up the emotion or to set up the storyline. You can't do that in 60 seconds, 30 seconds, 90 seconds. Like, I'm forcing myself to fit the time frame of the platform, and it doesn't work for art. Right? It doesn't work for the space that I want to be in as a creator.